My therapist called me panicked. Someone's been following me for weeks. 20 minutes later, a private investigator contacted me. Your father hired me to record your therapy sessions. He wants transcripts of everything you've discussed about him. That night, staring at my therapy appointment card, the one I'd hidden in my wallet for 8 months like a secret rebellion, I realized my father's control had reached places I thought were finally safe. My name is Amanda, and this is the story of how a private investigator became my unlikely ally and how my father's paranoia finally revealed the truth about toxic love. Before I tell you how one phone call changed everything I thought I knew about my father's protection, subscribe and share this story with someone who knows what it's like to fight for their own mind. Comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I love connecting with people who've had to find their voice. What happened next taught me that sometimes the people hired to hurt us end up being the ones who save us. The fluorescent light above my kitchen sink flickered with that annoying buzz that usually drove me crazy. But tonight I barely noticed it as I stared at the chaos spread across my granite countertop. My black leather wallet lay split open like a wounded bird, its contents scattered from when I'd frantically searched for Dr. Martinez's emergency contact card 23 minutes ago. The therapy appointment card, cream-colored with slightly frayed edges from 8 months of careful hiding, sat between a Starbucks receipt from last Tuesday and my insurance card, looking so innocent for something that had just become evidence in what felt like a crime scene. My iPhone still felt warm against my ear from Dr. Martinez's call, her usually calm therapist voice fractured with something I'd never heard before, genuine fear. Amanda, I know this sounds paranoid, but I've been followed for over 2 weeks. Same silver Honda Civic, license plate that starts with GHJ, parked outside my office building every Tuesday and Thursday when you come in. Yesterday I saw him at Morrison's Deli where I always grab lunch after our sessions, sitting 3 tables away with a telephoto lens pointed directly at my booth. The second call came while I was still processing her words, my cordless phone's shrill ring cutting through the silence of my small apartment like a blade. The voice belonged to someone who introduced himself as Michael Torres, and his first words made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Miss Clark, I'm calling because my conscience won't let me continue with this assignment. Your father, William Clark, hired my private investigation firm 6 weeks ago to conduct surveillance on Dr. Patricia Martinez. He specifically requested documentation of your therapy sessions, claiming you were being subjected to what he termed psychological manipulation designed to destroy family bonds. The man's voice carried the weight of someone confessing a sin, each word delivered with careful precision as if he'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. He wanted transcripts, photographs of you entering and leaving her office, records of your emotional state before and after sessions, and if possible, audio recordings of your actual conversations with her. I sank onto my kitchen bar stool, the cold metal against my bare legs, sending goosebumps up my arms that had nothing to do with temperature. My fingers found that therapy card again, and I noticed for the first time how the edges had been worn smooth from nervous fidgeting during those early sessions when I was still terrified my father would somehow discover where I was going every Tuesday at 2 p.m. The card stock felt different now, contaminated somehow, like evidence in a courtroom rather than the lifeline it had been for the past 8 months. Mr. Torres, I managed to whisper, my voice sounding foreign in my own kitchen, are you telling me that my father hired you to spy on my mental health treatment? His heavy sigh traveled through the phone line. Yes, ma'am. And I'm calling because what he's asking me to do isn't just unethical, it's potentially illegal. HIPAA violations, stalking charges, invasion of privacy. Your father seems to believe that Dr. Martinez is programming you to hate him, but from what I've observed, you always leave her office looking lighter, like someone had lifted weight off your shoulders. The revelation hit me in waves, each one more devastating than the last. First came disbelief. Surely this was some kind of mistake, some misunderstanding about therapeutic boundaries that my overprotective father had stumbled into accidentally. Then came the horrifying realization that this surveillance had been happening for 6 weeks, which meant it had started right around the time I'd begun discussing my childhood in detail with Dr. Martinez, right when I'd finally found the courage to say the words emotional abuse out loud for the first time in my 20 years. The timeline wasn't coincidental, it was strategic. My father hadn't just suspected I was in therapy, he figured out that therapy was working, that I was finally developing the language to describe what had happened to me growing up in his house of impossible standards and surveillance disguised as love. How much does he know? I asked Torres, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice, even as my hands began to shake so violently I had to put the therapy card down before I tore it completely. Did you give him anything? The pause that followed felt like an eternity. I submitted one preliminary report 6 weeks ago before I understood what this was really about. I told him that you appeared to have a positive therapeutic relationship and that Dr. Martinez seemed to be helping you with anxiety management techniques. That's when he doubled my fee and started demanding more invasive surveillance. I've been stalling ever since, telling him that gaining access to actual session content would take time and specialized equipment. My relief was short-lived as he continued, but Miss Clark, he's not going to accept delays much longer. He's already asking about other firms, ones that might be less concerned with legal boundaries. I'm calling because I think you need to know what's coming, and because someone needs to warn Dr. Martinez that this situation is escalating beyond simple curiosity about your well-being. As I hung up the phone, the familiar sounds of my apartment building seemed amplified in the silence. Mrs. Henderson's television murmuring through the thin walls, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic on Cedar Street. But underneath it all, I swear I could hear something new, the sound of my carefully constructed sense of safety crumbling like old paper. How did it come to this? How had my journey toward mental health become grounds for a private investigation, complete with surveillance photos and behavioral analysis reports? The therapy card lay before me, no longer a symbol of courage, but evidence of how thoroughly my father's need for control had infected even the spaces where I tried to heal from his control. Tomorrow I would have to call Dr. Martinez back, and together we would figure out how to proceed when the very act of seeking help had become the thing we needed protection from. Sitting there with Torres's words still echoing in my mind, I was suddenly 7 years old again, standing in my childhood bedroom doorway watching my father install the third lock on my door, not to keep intruders out, but to keep me in, though he'd never phrase it that way, because William Clark always had noble reasons for everything he did. "Daddy's special girl needs extra protection," he'd said back then, his rough carpenter's hands gentle as they adjusted the new deadbolt that could only be opened from the outside, and I remember feeling so important, so cherished, completely unaware that I was watching my cage being constructed with precision and love. The smell of his Old Spice cologne mixed with sawdust from his workshop still triggers something primal in me, that feeling of being simultaneously the most precious thing in the world and completely trapped, because love and control had become so intertwined in our house that I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. My father was the kind of man who checked my homework not once but 3 times, who read every book I borrowed from the library before I was allowed to touch it, who installed software on our family computer that sent him screenshots of every website I visited, every email I sent, every chat conversation I had with friends, all in the name of keeping his little girl safe from a world he viewed as fundamentally dangerous and corrupt. "Amanda doesn't need privacy," he'd tell my mother when she'd weekly protest during their whispered late-night arguments that I'd listened to through the thin walls, my ear pressed against the cold plaster as I tried to understand why other kids at school seemed to have secrets while I lived in a fishbowl of constant observation and commentary. Privacy is where bad things grow in little girls' minds, where they start thinking their father doesn't know what's best for them. The irony wasn't lost on me now that those very words, "privacy is where bad things grow," had somehow evolved into hiring a private investigator to violate my therapist's privacy, as if the 8-year-old girl who couldn't even choose her own bedtime had somehow become a master manipulator capable of being brainwashed by a licensed mental health professional. I remember the ritual of coming home from school every day, shoes off at the door, backpack emptied onto the kitchen table for inspection, every paper examined and questioned, every grade celebrated or criticized with equal intensity, every interaction with teachers or classmates dissected until I learned to make my school experiences as unremarkable as possible just to avoid the interrogation. "Tell Daddy about your day, sweetheart," was never really a request but a command performance where I learned to edit my experiences in real time, omitting anything that might trigger his concern, his advice, his need to intervene and fix whatever he perceived as threatening to my well-being or his relationship with me. Birthday parties became opportunities for him to quiz other parents about their supervision standards, Sleepovers were carefully vetted expeditions where he'd call the host family multiple times throughout the night. Even school field trips required detailed itineraries and his personal approval of every adult supervisor involved, because trusting other people with his daughter's safety was essentially impossible for a man who saw dangers lurking behind every corner and manipulation hiding behind every smile. The photograph albums from my childhood tell a story of a smiling little girl who never seemed to be alone, my father's presence looming behind me in every picture, his hand on my shoulder, his voice directing me to smile for Daddy, in that tone that made it clear that my happiness was not just expected but required, that my contentment was proof of his successful parenting, and any sign of distress was a failure that needed immediate correction. My friends started avoiding our house by the time I was 10, not because my father was mean to them, but because he was too interested, too involved, asking too many questions about their families, their plans, their influences on his daughter, until spending time with me felt like being interviewed by a friendly but relentless detective who viewed every childhood friendship as a potential threat to his carefully constructed environment. Looking back now with adult eyes and 8 months of Dr. Martinez's patient questioning, I could see the pattern that had been invisible to me as a child. I was never allowed to have secrets, never permitted the normal privacy that helps children develop into independent adults, never given the space to form my own opinions without my father's immediate input and subtle correction. Every diary I tried to keep was discovered and read for my safety. Every phone conversation was monitored to make sure I wasn't being bullied. Every friendship was analyzed and often discouraged because those children don't understand what real family love looks like. Until I learned that the safest way to exist in my father's love was to want nothing he hadn't already approved, to think nothing he hadn't already shaped, to be nothing more than his perfectly crafted reflection of what a daughter should be. The most chilling realization, sitting there in my adult kitchen with the evidence of his continued surveillance spread before me, was that he'd never stopped seeing me as that 7-year-old girl who needed extra locks on her door, not to protect her from the world, but to protect his version of love from any outside influence that might teach her she deserved to exist beyond the borders of his need to control, monitor, and possess the one person who'd never been allowed to leave. The first time I sat in Dr. Martinez's waiting room 8 months ago, I told my father I was going to Target, and then to grab coffee with my college friend Sarah. A lie that required me to actually buy something at Target and take a selfie at Starbucks afterward to maintain the illusion, because at 27 years old I was still living like a teenager sneaking out past curfew. Except instead of partying, I was trying to figure out why I couldn't sleep through the night without checking my phone for missed calls from him 17 times. Dr. Martinez's office smelled like lavender and something else I couldn't identify. Later I'd learn it was the vanilla candle she lit between sessions. And for the first time in my adult life, I was sitting in a room where my father's presence wasn't hovering like a ghost in the corner, where his opinions weren't hanging in the air waiting to be consulted, where his voice wasn't echoing in my mind with commentary about every thought I dared to think independently. "What brings you here today, Amanda?" Dr. Martinez had asked in that gentle therapist voice, and I'd sat there for what felt like an eternity because I literally didn't know how to answer a question about my own needs without first considering how my father would want me to respond, what version of myself he'd approve of me presenting to the stranger who might judge his parenting or question his methods or, worst of all, encourage me to make decisions without his input. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap, and finally I'd whispered, "I think something might be wrong with me because I'm 27 and I still feel like I need permission to exist." Words that tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them, followed immediately by a terror so profound I actually looked toward the door to make sure my father hadn't somehow materialized there to witness this betrayal of family loyalty. What if he finds out I'm talking? The question pounded in my head like a drumbeat throughout that entire first session, drowning out Dr. Martinez's patient explanations about anxiety and trauma responses and something called enmeshment that made my stomach churn because it sounded too much like what my father called close family bonds for me to feel comfortable hearing it described as unhealthy. But then something miraculous happened in the safety of that lavender-scented room. I started breathing differently, deeper, like my lungs were finally allowed to expand to their full capacity after years of holding my breath, waiting for my father's approval, or criticism, or analysis of every inhale and exhale. Dr. Martinez, didn't take notes during our session. Some clients find it distracting, she explained, which meant I could speak without worrying about written evidence of my disloyalty being somehow discovered, though I caught myself still editing my words in real time, still softening the edges of memories that might make my father sound too controlling, too invasive, too much like the kind of parent other people would call problematic. "It's normal to feel conflicted about discussing family relationships," she'd said when I apologized for the third time for probably making my dad sound worse than he is. And something about the way she said normal made me want to cry because I couldn't remember the last time anything about my emotional experience had been labeled as normal rather than proof that I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too ungrateful for the love and protection I'd been given. The session lasted 50 minutes, but it felt simultaneously like 5 minutes and 5 hours, time moving differently when you're not constantly calculating how your words might be received, analyzed, and reported back to the person who's trained you to believe that his emotional well-being depends on your complete transparency and compliance. Walking back to my car afterward, I felt like I was floating and drowning at the same time, liberated by the experience of speaking without immediate feedback or correction, but terrified by the knowledge that I'd just spent an hour discussing my father with someone he didn't know, hadn't vetted, couldn't control. And the guilt was so overwhelming, I almost called him right there in the parking lot to confess what I'd done and beg forgiveness for my betrayal of family trust. Instead, I'd driven to Target and bought the candle and body wash I'd claimed I needed, then sat in Starbucks for exactly 47 minutes taking pictures of my latte and texting with Sarah about nothing important, creating the digital breadcrumbs that would support my story when my father inevitably asked for a detailed account of my afternoon activities. The elaborate deception required to protect 1 hour of honest conversation about my own mental health should have been a red flag, but instead it just felt like survival, like the necessary cost of maintaining peace in a relationship where my emotional autonomy was seen as a direct threat to his parental authority and his identity as a loving, protective father. That night, lying in my apartment bed staring at the ceiling, I'd replayed every word of the session, analyzing Dr. Martinez's responses for signs that she thought I was crazy, ungrateful, or making mountains out of molehills, because even in the safety of therapy I couldn't escape the voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my father asking, "Are you sure you're remembering that correctly, sweetheart? Are you sure you're not being a little dramatic? Are you sure this person has your best interests at heart the way your family does?" But underneath all that familiar self-doubt was something new and fragile and terrifying, the possibility that my experience mattered, that my feelings were valid, that maybe, just maybe, I deserved to have thoughts and emotions that belonged entirely to me, even if sharing them felt like the ultimate act of rebellion against everything I'd been taught about love, loyalty, and what good daughters owe their fathers who've sacrificed so much to keep them safe from a world that would never love them the way he did. Sitting there processing Torres's revelation about the private investigator, I was suddenly transported back to last Christmas dinner when my mother had pulled me aside in the kitchen while my father carved the turkey in the dining room, her hands shaking slightly as she pretended to check the rolls in the oven for the third time in 10 minutes. "Amanda, honey," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my father's booming laughter echoing from the other room as he told his annual story about the time he'd outsmarted a contractor who tried to overcharge him. Are you taking care of yourself these days? Really taking care of yourself?" The way she emphasized really made my stomach clench because it was the closest my mother had ever come to acknowledging that something in our family wasn't quite right, that the constant monitoring and analysis and involvement that my father called love might actually be something else entirely, something that required taking care of oneself in ways that had nothing to do with eating vegetables and getting enough sleep. My mother, Patricia Clark, had been beautiful once. I'd seen the wedding photos where her smile reached her eyes and her posture suggested someone who believed she deserved to take up space in the world. But somewhere between 1987 and now she developed this way of existing that reminded me of a bird that had learned to keep its wings folded tight against its body to avoid attracting attention from predators, even when there was room to fly. She'd stopped fighting back years ago, not through any dramatic surrender, but through the slow erosion that happens when someone spends 35 years having their every opinion questioned, their every decision second-guessed, their every emotional response analyzed and often corrected by someone who genuinely believes they know better than you do about your own inner life. I remembered watching her during my teenage years, how she'd start to express an opinion about something, a movie we'd watched, a news story, a decision about redecorating the living room, and then she'd catch my father's expression, and her voice would trail off into uncertainty, her confidence dissolving like sugar in rain until she'd end up asking him what she should think instead of finishing her original thought. "What do you think, Bill?" became her default response to almost everything, from what to make for dinner to whether she liked a song on the radio, and I used to think it was sweet how much she valued his opinion until I realized she'd forgotten how to have opinions of her own, how to trust her own instincts, how to exist in the world without constant confirmation that her thoughts and feelings were acceptable to the man who'd appointed himself the final authority on her emotional and intellectual life. The kitchen conversation last Christmas had been her trying to tell me something she couldn't say directly, couldn't risk my father overhearing, couldn't even fully admit to herself, that she recognized something in my controlled, careful existence that mirrored her own slow disappearance into the background of her own life, that she saw me becoming another version of herself, someone who'd learned to survive by becoming smaller and smaller until there was almost nothing left to threaten or challenge or disappoint the man who loved us so much he couldn't bear to let us exist independently. "Your father means well," she'd added quickly, glancing toward the dining room where we could hear him still holding court with my uncle about interest rates and property values. "He just worries because he loves us so much, but sometimes—" And then she'd stopped, unable or unwilling to finish that sentence, leaving me to fill in the blanks with all the things she couldn't say about love that felt like surveillance, protection that felt like imprisonment, care that gradually stripped away your ability to care for yourself. The tragedy of my mother's quiet desperation wasn't just that she'd lost herself somewhere in 35 years of marriage to a man who equated love with control, but that she'd become complicit in teaching me to do the same thing, to accept his monitoring as evidence of his devotion, to interpret his inability to trust my judgment as proof of how much I mattered to him, to see my growing dependence on his approval as a sign of healthy family closeness rather than a systematic dismantling of my autonomy that started when I was too young to recognize what was happening. She'd learned to find safety in surrender, peace in the absence of conflict that came from never disagreeing, never challenging, never insisting on space to think thoughts he hadn't pre-approved, and she'd passed that survival strategy on to me like a family heirloom I didn't realize was actually a chain. But sitting there in my kitchen with the evidence of my father's latest attempt to monitor and control my healing process spread across the counter, I felt something crystallize inside me that was both a promise to my mother and a refusal to become her. I would not spend the next 35 years of my life disappearing into someone else's idea of who I should be, would not teach my future children that love means giving up the right to privacy, would not perpetuate this cycle of control, disguised as protection that had already stolen one generation of women's voices and threatened to steal mine too. My mother's kitchen warning hadn't been just concern for my well-being. It had been a desperate attempt to save me from following her path into the kind of love that gradually erases you, one boundary violation at a time, until you wake up one day and realize you've forgotten how to exist without permission, how to think without approval, how to be yourself without first checking to make sure that self is acceptable to the person who claims to love you more than anyone else in the world ever could. The therapy appointment card became my most carefully guarded secret, more protected than my diary had ever been as a teenager, more hidden than the birth control pills I'd started taking at 24 and kept in an empty Advil bottle in the back of my bathroom cabinet where my father would never think to look during his periodic wellness checks of my apartment that he disguised as casual visits to make sure I was eating properly and keeping the place clean enough for his standards. Every Tuesday at 1:15 p.m., I would perform the same elaborate ritual, drive to the CVS pharmacy 3 blocks from Dr. Martinez's office, buy something small and forgettable, usually gum or lip balm, to create a receipt with the right timestamp and location, then sit in my car for exactly 7 minutes checking my phone and breathing deeply, trying to calm the anxiety that still spiked every week as I prepared to do something my father didn't know about, didn't approve of, couldn't monitor or analyze or offer his input on. The appointment card itself lived in a secret compartment of my wallet that I discovered by accident, a thin pocket behind my driver's license where the cream-colored cardstock fit perfectly, invisible unless someone was specifically looking for it, and I developed this unconscious habit of touching that spot throughout the week like a talisman, a reminder that I had something that belonged entirely to me, even if that something was just 50 minutes of supervised conversation about why I couldn't make decisions without my father's approval. The physical act of hiding the card had become almost as important as the therapy itself, carefully sliding it into its secret spot after each appointment, making sure it was completely concealed, running my fingers over the leather surface to ensure there was no telltale bump or ridge that might betray its presence if my father happened to see me pay for something and notice my wallet lying open on a restaurant table or car dashboard. The elaborate cover stories I created for those Tuesday afternoon disappearances were works of fiction worthy of a spy novel, each one carefully constructed with verifiable details and digital evidence that would satisfy my father's inevitable questions about how I'd spent my time and whether I'd encountered anything or anyone that might require his analysis or intervention. I became an expert at creating fake text message threads with imaginary friends, scheduling real appointments with my hairstylist or dentist on alternate Tuesdays to establish a pattern of legitimate absences, even going so far as to take photographs of mundane locations, the waiting room at my gynecologist's office, the customer service counter at my bank, the parking lot outside Target, that I could reference weeks later when my father would ask for specific details about where I'd been and what I'd seen. His questions delivered with the casual interest of someone making conversation, but carrying the weight of a cross-examination that demanded complete transparency and total recall. The mental energy required to maintain this double life was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated, not just remembering which lie I'd told about which Tuesday, but also monitoring my own emotional state after therapy sessions to make sure I didn't accidentally reveal that I'd spent the afternoon discussing my family dynamics with a professional who was trained to recognize unhealthy patterns and dysfunction disguised as love. Some Tuesdays, I'd leave Dr. Martinez's office feeling lighter, more hopeful, closer to understanding why I felt like a stranger in my own life, but I'd have to carefully compose my face and modulate my voice before going home or calling my father, because unexplained happiness was almost as suspicious as unexplained sadness in a relationship where my emotional transparency was considered both a gift to him and a responsibility I owed in exchange for his protection and devotion. The bathroom in my apartment became my confession booth, the place where I would stand in front of the mirror after each therapy session and practice looking normal, practice answering the questions my father would inevitably ask about my day, practice being the version of myself he expected to see rather than the version that was slowly emerging in the safety of Dr. Martinez's office. Someone who was beginning to understand that her anxiety might not be a character flaw but a reasonable response to living under constant surveillance and analysis, that her inability to make simple decisions might not be evidence of immaturity but the predictable result of 27 years of having every choice questioned, corrected, or overruled by someone who genuinely believed he knew better than she did about her own needs and desires. I would rehearse casual responses to his inquiries about my afternoon. "Oh, just ran some errands. Nothing exciting," delivered with exactly the right amount of eye contact and relaxed body language, because too much enthusiasm would prompt follow-up questions about what had made me so happy, while too little would trigger concern about my mental state and potentially lead to suggestions that I might benefit from talking to someone professional, the cruel irony being that I was already talking to someone professional. I was just doing it in secret because I knew that my father's version of professional help would involve him interviewing the therapist first, explaining his concerns about my sensitivity and need for guidance, essentially ensuring that even my mental health treatment would become another extension of his monitoring and control rather than a space where I could finally figure out who I might be if I wasn't constantly performing the role of the grateful, transparent, perpetually accessible daughter he trained me to believe was the only version of myself worth loving. By month 3 of therapy, something extraordinary began happening in my body that I didn't even recognize at first. My shoulders started to relax during the drive to Dr. Martinez's office, the tension that normally lived between my shoulder blades like a permanent visitor gradually releasing as I turned into the parking lot of the small professional building where she practiced. My nervous system, somehow learning to distinguish between the hypervigilance required for navigating my father's constant emotional monitoring and the completely different energy of a space where I could speak without immediately calculating how my words would be received, analyzed, and potentially used against me in future conversations about my attitude or gratitude or mental stability. Dr. Martinez had become my sanctuary in ways I struggled to articulate even to myself, not just because she listened without interrupting or correcting, but because she had this remarkable ability to help me recognize thoughts and feelings I'd been having for years without realizing they were valid human experiences rather than character defects that needed to be fixed or hidden or apologized for constantly. "It makes sense that you would feel anxious about making decisions," she'd say when I described my paralysis in grocery stores, standing in the cereal aisle for 20 minutes trying to choose between Cheerios and Corn Flakes because I'd learned that every choice I made would be somehow evaluated and potentially criticized. When someone has spent their entire life having their preferences questioned or overruled, the simple act of choosing becomes fraught with danger. The way she said it makes sense, with such gentle certainty, made me want to cry every single time, because those 3 words validated experiences I'd been taught to dismiss as evidence of my oversensitivity, my immaturity, my inability to appreciate how much easier my life was when someone else handled the difficult work of decision-making and analysis and protecting me from my own poor judgment. Week by week, session by session, I started to notice small changes in how I moved through the world outside that lavender-scented office. I began ordering different drinks at Starbucks instead of always getting the same vanilla latte my father had pronounced a good choice for someone with your sensitive stomach, started taking different routes home from work just because I could, even bought a book from the psychology section at Barnes and Noble without first researching whether it was something my father would approve of me reading, or whether it might contain ideas that would upset him or make him worry about outside influences on my mental health. These tiny acts of autonomy felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, like learning to walk on a tightrope where one misstep might reveal that I was becoming someone my father wouldn't recognize, wouldn't approve of, wouldn't love with the same intensity that had shaped every day of my existence since childhood. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that healing wasn't just about feeling better, it was about developing what she called internal regulation, the ability to soothe myself when anxious, to trust my own perceptions when they conflicted with other people's versions of reality, to sit with uncomfortable emotions without immediately seeking someone else's guidance about what those feelings meant or how I should respond to them. The concept of trusting my own mind was so foreign it felt like learning a new language, one where I was allowed to have opinions that didn't require external validation, preferences that didn't need to be justified or defended, emotional reactions that were simply information about my inner world rather than problems that needed to be solved by someone wiser and more experienced in navigating life's complexities. Month 6 brought what Dr. Martinez called a breakthrough, though it felt more like a breakdown at the time. I'd finally found the courage to describe the locks on my childhood bedroom door, the daily homework inspections, the computer monitoring, the constant questions about my whereabouts and emotional state, and instead of minimizing these experiences or finding explanations that made my father sound more reasonable, she quietly said, "Amanda, what you're describing sounds like emotional incest," a term that made my stomach lurch because it suggested something far more serious and damaging than the overprotective parenting I'd been using to describe my upbringing to myself and others. But even as that clinical term sent shock waves through my nervous system, there was also relief in having language for experiences that had never felt quite normal but had been presented to me as evidence of exceptional love, extraordinary dedication, the kind of father-daughter bond that other families envied and admired. Dr. Martinez became not just my therapist but my translator, helping me understand that emotional enmeshment wasn't love but a form of psychological possession, that constant monitoring wasn't protection but control, that my father's inability to tolerate my privacy wasn't evidence of how much he cared but a sign of his own emotional dysfunction that had been masquerading as devotion for so long that I'd internalized his narrative about our special relationship and his unique understanding of what I needed to be safe and happy in a world that would never love me the way he did. By month 8, I was sleeping through the night for the first time in years, had stopped checking my phone obsessively for missed calls or texts that might indicate my father needed immediate reassurance about my well-being, and had even begun to imagine what it might feel like to make major life decisions about my career, my relationships, my living situation, without first conducting elaborate mental consultations with his voice in my head, asking what he would think, what he would want. What would make him proud versus what might disappoint or worry him enough to trigger one of his intense conversations about my judgment and his fears for my future. It started with the questions about Dr. Patterson, a name I'd never mentioned to my father because Dr. Patterson didn't exist. He was a fictitious dentist I'd invented months earlier to explain my Tuesday afternoon absences, complete with a fake dental practice located conveniently near the Target where I often stopped after therapy to maintain my cover story. "How are your teeth feeling after that deep cleaning last week?" my father had asked during our regular Wednesday evening phone call, his voice carrying that particular tone of casual interest that I'd learned to recognize as anything but casual, the way a predator might ask about the weather while calculating wind speed and direction before making a kill. Something cold settled in my stomach as I realized I'd never told him about any dental work, had never mentioned Dr. Patterson by name, had certainly never described getting a deep cleaning. Because my fictional dental visits were supposed to be routine cleanings that required no follow-up questions or expressions of parental concern about my oral health, and whether I was flossing regularly enough to avoid the gum disease that ran in his family and might require expensive treatment if left unchecked. "Oh, fine," I'd managed to say, my voice sounding strange and high-pitched in my own ears. Just the usual lecture about flossing more often. But even as I delivered this improvised response, I was mentally scrambling to figure out how he could possibly know details about appointments that had never happened with a dentist who existed only in my elaborate web of Tuesday afternoon alibis. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, my father asking seemingly innocent questions about my work schedule, my weekend plans, whether I'd been getting enough sleep lately because I sounded tired, whether I was eating enough vegetables because he'd read an article about nutrition and mental health that had made him concerned about my vitamin levels and their potential impact on my mood and energy. But underneath his familiar pattern of loving interrogation disguised as concern, there was something different, something that made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't articulate even to myself, a quality of attention that felt less like a father checking on his daughter's well-being and more like a detective gathering evidence for a case he was building against someone he suspected of lying, cheating, or betraying his trust in ways he couldn't yet prove but absolutely believed were happening. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Instead of offering solutions to problems I hadn't mentioned having, he was asking follow-up questions that seemed designed to catch inconsistencies in stories I'd told weeks or months earlier, his usually expansive monologues about his own work and concerns replaced by focused inquiries about my activities, my emotional state, my relationships with coworkers and friends whose names he'd somehow memorized despite my careful efforts to keep my social life vague and unremarkable in our conversations. "How is that friend of yours, Sarah?" he'd asked, and I'd felt my blood pressure spike because I'd mentioned Sarah exactly once, 3 months earlier, and only in passing as someone I'd grab coffee with. Not someone whose ongoing friendship and influence on my life would normally warrant regular check-ins from a father who'd never shown interest in my adult friendships, unless he suspected they might be encouraging me to make decisions he wouldn't approve of or developing independence he hadn't authorized. The most unsettling change was in his eyes during our face-to-face interactions, family dinners, brief visits to my apartment, chance encounters at the grocery store where he'd somehow appeared in the same aisle I was shopping in despite living across town and having no apparent reason to be in my neighborhood at that particular time on that specific afternoon. Something had shifted behind his familiar expression of paternal concern, a new quality of assessment that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope rather than a daughter receiving love and attention from someone who genuinely cared about her happiness and well-being. His hugs lasted longer than usual, his hands lingering on my shoulders as if he could somehow detect deception through physical contact, his questions about my day delivered with an intensity that suggested he was listening not just to my words but to my tone, my breathing, the pauses between sentences where he might detect evidence of secrets I was keeping, lies I was telling, or influences I was allowing into my life without his knowledge or approval. Even his compliments felt loaded with suspicion. "You seem different lately, sweetheart. More confident, maybe? I hope that's not because someone's been filling your head with ideas about independence that might not be in your best interest in the long run." Delivered with his characteristic smile but carrying an undertone of threat that made it clear that my growing sense of self was not necessarily something he viewed as positive development, especially if it meant I might start making choices that prioritize my own judgment over his guidance and protection. The final straw came during a Sunday dinner at my parents' house, when I'd excused myself to use the bathroom and returned to find my father holding my purse, claiming he'd been just moving it so Mom could set down the dessert plates. But his hands were positioned exactly where my wallet would be if he'd been trying to open it discreetly. And when our eyes met across the dining room table, I saw something I'd never seen before in his expression, the cold calculation of someone who no longer trusted me, who suspected I was living a double life, who was actively looking for evidence to prove theories about my behavior that he developed through methods I couldn't begin to guess. That night, driving home from dinner with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, followed, analyzed by someone who loved me so much he was willing to violate my privacy to protect me from myself, and the terrible irony that the very healing work I was doing in therapy, learning to trust my instincts, recognizing manipulation, developing boundaries, was exactly what was making me sensitive enough to notice that something in my father's behavior had shifted from loving concern to something far more dangerous and desperate, something that felt less like protection and more like preparation for war against any influence that might teach his daughter she deserved to exist beyond the reaches of his control, monitoring, and possession. Dr. Martinez had never called me outside of our scheduled sessions in 8 months of therapy, which is why seeing her name on my caller ID at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening sent an immediate jolt of adrenaline through my nervous system, my first thought being that something terrible had happened to her. My second thought being that my father had somehow discovered our therapeutic relationship and had contacted her directly to demand explanations about what we discussed and whether she was encouraging me to be disrespectful or ungrateful or distant from the family that loved me more than anyone else in the world ever could. But the voice that greeted me when I answered wasn't the calm, measured tone I'd grown accustomed to during our Tuesday afternoon sessions. Instead, Dr. Martinez sounded breathless, frightened, speaking rapidly in a way that reminded me of how I'd felt during those early therapy sessions when I was terrified my father would somehow materialize in her waiting room to drag me home and demand explanations about why I felt the need to discuss our family with strangers who couldn't possibly understand the complexity of our relationships or the depth of his love and concern for my well-being. "Amanda, I'm sorry to call you like this, but I need to tell you something that's going to sound paranoid, but I've been followed for over 2 weeks now," she said, her words tumbling over each other like someone who'd been holding their breath for days and finally found a safe place to exhale. The same silver Honda Civic with tinted windows, license plate that starts with GHJ, parked outside my office building every Tuesday and Thursday when you come in, and yesterday I saw the same car and the same man at Morrison's Deli where I always grabbed lunch after our sessions. The clinical detachment that usually characterized her professional demeanor had been replaced by something raw and human and terrified, and hearing my therapist, the one person in my adult life who'd seemed immune to the kind of surveillance and analysis that characterized every other relationship I'd ever had, admit that she was being watched, followed, documented, made my stomach drop like I was falling from a great height with no idea where or when I might land. As she continued describing the details of her surveillance, the telephoto lens she'd spotted pointed at her booth in the deli, the way the man had immediately started his car and pulled away when she'd walked directly toward him in the parking lot outside her office, the feeling of being watched that had become so constant she'd started varying her routes home and checking her rearview mirror obsessively. I felt something shift inside me that was part recognition, part horror, part terrible. Confirmation of fears I'd been trying to dismiss as paranoia brought on by too much therapy and too much focus on my father's controlling behaviors, rather than gratitude for his protective instincts and lifelong dedication to my safety and happiness. "Dr. Martinez," I heard myself saying, my voice sounding distant and strange like it was coming from someone else's mouth. "What did this man look like? Was he older, maybe in his 50s, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt? Did he have graying hair and the kind of mustache that looks like it was trimmed with a ruler?" Even as I asked these questions, I knew I was describing my father's type, the kind of man he would hire, someone who looked trustworthy and professional and completely unremarkable, someone who could blend into any suburban environment without attracting attention or suspicion, someone whose presence wouldn't immediately scream private investigator. To anyone who might notice him sitting in restaurant booths or parking lots with cameras and notebooks and whatever other equipment modern surveillance required, The silence that followed my description felt like confirmation of my worst fears, and when Dr. Martinez finally spoke again, her voice was smaller, more frightened than before. Amanda, that's exactly what he looked like. How could you possibly know that? The conversation that followed felt surreal, like we were characters in a thriller movie rather than a therapist and patient discussing the violation of professional boundaries and personal privacy by someone who claimed to love me so much he couldn't bear the thought of me receiving help he couldn't monitor, control, and potentially sabotage if it led me to conclusions about our relationship that challenged his narrative about healthy family dynamics and appropriate parental involvement in adult children's lives. Dr. Martinez and I had become reluctant conspirators, united by the shared experience of being watched, analyzed, and documented by someone whose love had metastasized into something toxic and invasive, something that couldn't tolerate the existence of spaces where I might develop thoughts, feelings, or insights that belonged entirely to me without his input, approval, or understanding. We both realized we weren't safe, she said finally, her professional training apparently unable to provide adequate language for a situation where a patient's father had hired someone to conduct surveillance on her mental health treatment, to gather evidence of conversations protected by doctor-patient confidentiality, to essentially infiltrate the one relationship in my life that had been helping me understand that privacy wasn't selfishness, boundaries weren't disrespect, and healing wasn't betrayal of family loyalty. The call ended with us agreeing to meet the next day to figure out how to proceed, how to protect both her practice and my recovery from someone whose definition of love had expanded to include hiring strangers to violate the most intimate aspects of my journey toward emotional independence and mental health. And as I hung up the phone, I realized that the paranoia I'd been feeling for weeks wasn't paranoia at all. It was the accurate perception of someone whose father's need for control had finally crossed the line from psychological manipulation into what could only be described as stalking, surveillance, and systematic invasion of privacy, disguised as concern for my well-being and protection from influences he decided were dangerous to our relationship, and my continued dependence on his guidance, approval, and definition of what love should look and feel like. The 20 minutes between Dr. Martinez hanging up and my phone ringing again felt like 20 hours, each minute crawling by with the excruciating slowness of time moving underwater, my apartment suddenly feeling like a glass house where every shadow outside my windows could be someone watching, waiting, documenting my reactions to the news that my mental health treatment had become the subject of professional surveillance commissioned by the man who taught me that love meant never having secrets, never requiring privacy, never needing space that didn't include his presence, input, and analysis of my every emotional state and life choice. I found myself pacing between my kitchen and living room like a caged animal, my bare feet making soft slapping sounds against the hardwood floors that seemed amplified in the silence, each footstep marking another second in this surreal countdown towards some revelation I wasn't sure I was prepared to hear, some confirmation of suspicions that would fundamentally alter my understanding of how far my father's definition of protective love was willing to extend into territories that any reasonable person would recognize as violation, manipulation, and abuse disguised as concern for my well-being and resistance to influences he couldn't control or approve. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my fingertips, in the base of my skull where tension headaches always started when I was forced to confront the gap between my father's narrative about our relationship and the increasingly undeniable reality that his love had become something predatory, possessive, and fundamentally incompatible with my continued existence as an autonomous adult with a right to private thoughts, professional relationships, and healing processes that didn't require his oversight or permission. The rational part of my mind kept trying to construct alternative explanations for what Dr. Martinez had described. Maybe the man following her was connected to another patient. Maybe the surveillance was related to some other aspect of her practice. Maybe my father's recent behavior changes were coincidental rather than evidence of an escalating campaign to monitor and potentially sabotage my therapy sessions. But my body knew better, my nervous system responding to this crisis with the hypervigilance of someone who'd spent 28 years learning to detect the subtle signs of impending confrontation, criticism, or invasion disguised as loving concern for my choices, my mental state, My need for guidance from someone wiser and more experienced in navigating the complexities of adult life without making mistakes that might damage my future happiness or family relationships. I kept checking my phone every 30 seconds, not because I expected it to ring, but because the act of looking at the screen gave me something to do with my hands, some way to measure the passage of time that felt both interminable and racing towards some moment of truth I wasn't sure I wanted to reach. Some conversation that would either prove my worst fears correct or provide some innocent explanation that would allow me to return to the fragile sense of safety I'd been building through 8 months of therapy sessions my father apparently knew about in far more detail than I'd ever imagined possible. The digital clock on my microwave became my enemy, its green numbers glowing like a countdown timer towards some explosion that would either destroy my relationship with my father or destroy my faith in my own perceptions, my ability to distinguish between love and control, protection and possession, concern and surveillance. Every sound outside my apartment sent adrenaline shooting through my system like liquid fire. The slam of a car door in the parking lot could be my father arriving to confront me about my betrayal of family trust. The footsteps in the hallway outside my door could be the private investigator coming to deliver evidence of my disloyalty and ingratitude. The buzz of my neighbor's television through the thin walls could be covering the sound of someone positioned outside my windows with the same telephoto lens that had been documenting Dr. Martinez's lunch routine and daily movements around the small professional complex where she practiced. My mouth felt dry as sandpaper, my palms slick with sweat that I kept wiping on my jeans, my breathing shallow and rapid like I was trying to extract oxygen from air that had suddenly become too thin to sustain normal respiratory function, my entire nervous system preparing for fight or flight in response to a threat that was both everywhere and nowhere, both confirmed and still theoretical, both the logical culmination of 28 years of gradually escalating control and an unthinkable violation of boundaries I'd never imagined my father would be willing to cross. The terrible irony wasn't lost on me that the anxiety attack I was experiencing in response to learning about my father's surveillance of my therapy was exactly the kind of episode Dr. Martinez had been helping me understand, process, and manage through techniques I'd learned in sessions that were apparently being monitored, analyzed, and reported back to the person whose behavior was causing the very symptoms I was seeking professional help to address. When my phone finally rang at exactly 7:07 p.m., the sound cutting through the silence of my apartment like a fire alarm, I realized that some fundamental aspect of my reality was about to shift permanently, that the next few minutes would either confirm my worst fears about my father's capacity for violation and control, or provide some alternative explanation that would allow me to continue believing in the possibility of healing, privacy, and autonomy within a relationship I'd been taught to see as the most important, protective, and loving connection I would ever have in my life, but which was increasingly revealing itself to be something far more complex, dangerous, and ultimately destructive than I'd ever been allowed to recognize or acknowledge even to myself. The voice that introduced itself as Michael Torres, private investigator, carried the weight of someone confessing a sin he'd been carrying around like a stone in his chest, his words delivered with the careful precision of a man who'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times, but still wasn't sure he was doing the right thing. Still wasn't certain that betraying a client's trust was justified even when that client had hired him to do things that made his stomach turn in his 23 years of investigative experience feel like preparation for a moral test he'd never expected to face. "Miss Clark," he began, and I could hear him take a deep breath like someone preparing to jump off a cliff. "I need to tell you about the assignment your father gave me, and I need you to know that I'm calling you instead of delivering my final report to him because what he's asking me to do crosses lines I didn't know existed when I took this job 6 weeks ago." His voice had the gravelly quality of someone who'd spent decades smoking cigarettes and drinking too much coffee in surveillance vehicles, but underneath the professional detachment I could detect something that sounded like genuine regret, maybe even shame, as if he'd looked into a mirror recently and hadn't liked what he'd seen reflected back. A man who'd built a career on gathering information people wanted to keep secret, but who'd apparently never been hired to systematically dismantle someone's mental health recovery for the sake of maintaining parental control, disguised as love and protection. The confession that followed felt like listening to someone describe a crime they'd been planning but ultimately couldn't bring themselves to commit. each detail more horrifying than the last as Torres explained how my father had approached his firm with what he'd initially described as concerns about his daughter's welfare and potential involvement with people who might be taking advantage of her emotional vulnerability during a difficult period in her life. Your father hired me to conduct comprehensive surveillance on Dr. Patricia Martinez, Torres continued, his voice growing steadier as if the act of confession was providing some relief from whatever internal conflict had been eating at him for weeks. But the scope of work he outlined went far beyond standard background checks or professional verification. He wanted detailed documentation of her daily routines, photographic evidence of your arrivals and departures from her office, analysis of your emotional state before and after sessions, and if possible, audio recordings of your actual conversations with her. The clinical way he described these violations made them sound like items on a grocery list rather than systematic invasion of privacy protected by doctor-patient confidentiality, but I could hear something in his tone that suggested he understood the magnitude of what he was describing, the difference between legitimate investigative work and what could only be called stalking enhanced by professional equipment and expertise. He specifically wanted me to document what he called evidence of parental alienation. Any signs that Dr. Martinez was encouraging you to distance yourself from family relationships or develop what he termed unhealthy independence that might interfere with your continued reliance on his guidance and support. The phrase unhealthy independence hit me like a physical blow because it perfectly captured my father's fundamental inability to distinguish between my growing emotional autonomy and some kind of betrayal of family loyalty. His conviction that my healing process was actually a form of brainwashing designed to turn me against the person who loved me more than anyone else in the world ever could or would. Torres paused for a long moment, and I could hear him moving around in what sounded like a car, maybe sitting in some parking lot having this conversation on his cell phone, because he didn't want his colleagues or family to overhear him admitting that he'd taken money to help a father spy on his adult daughter's therapy sessions, that he'd spent weeks documenting the movements and routines of a mental health professional whose only crime was helping someone recognize manipulation disguised as love. Miss Clark, I want you to understand something, he said finally, his voice softer now, almost gentle. In 23 years of investigative work, I've never been asked to do anything that made me feel like I was helping someone commit psychological abuse, but that's exactly what your father's assignment felt like after I started watching you and Dr. Martinez interact. Why would he help me instead? The question burned in my mind as Torres described how he'd observed my therapy sessions from his car in the parking lot, how he'd watched me walk into Dr. Martinez's office looking tense and anxious, and emerge 50 minutes later with something that looked like relief, hope, maybe even the beginning of peace, and how that visible transformation had made him realize that whatever was happening in those sessions wasn't manipulation or brainwashing but genuine healing that someone was paying him good money to document, analyze, and potentially destroy. I've got a daughter myself, he admitted, and suddenly his voice carried a different quality, the tone of a father trying to imagine circumstances under which he would hire someone to spy on his child's mental health treatment. And if she ever needed therapy, if she ever found someone who could help her work through whatever pain or confusion she was carrying, the last thing I'd want to do is interfere with that process, document it for my own peace of mind, or gather evidence to prove that her healing was somehow a threat to our relationship. The moral awakening in his voice was unmistakable as Torres explained his decision to contact me instead of delivering his final surveillance report to my father, how he'd spent sleepless nights thinking about the young woman he'd been watching through telephoto lenses, wondering what kind of pain had driven her to seek professional help, and what kind of father would respond to his daughter's healing journey by hiring someone to violate the privacy and safety of both patient and therapist. I'm calling because someone needs to warn you that your father isn't going to accept my recommendation to discontinue this investigation, Torres said, his words carrying the weight of someone who'd looked into the eyes of obsession and recognized something dangerous, something that wouldn't be satisfied with partial information or professional boundaries or ethical considerations about privacy and autonomy. He's already contacting other firms, ones that might be less concerned with legal boundaries, and I think you need to know what you're dealing with before the situation escalates beyond surveillance into something that could actually harm you, Dr. Martinez, or both. The unexpected ally I'd found in this stranger who'd been hired to document my healing process felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in the ocean of my father's love, And as Torres gave me his personal cell phone number and promised to provide documentation of everything my father had asked him to do, I realized that sometimes the people hired to hurt us end up being the ones who save us, who choose conscience over contract, who decide that some kinds of love are actually forms of possession that decent people have a moral obligation to resist, expose, and ultimately defeat. Torres agreed to meet me the next morning at a Denny's restaurant 20 miles outside Cedar Falls, far enough from my father's usual territory that we wouldn't risk an accidental encounter. And when I walked into that fluorescent-lit diner at 8:30 a.m., carrying the weight of a sleepless night and 8 months of violated privacy, I found him sitting in a corner booth with a manila folder thick enough to contain what looked like a comprehensive dossier on my entire mental health journey, his weathered face carrying the expression of someone about to show me evidence of crimes committed against my most intimate attempts at healing and self-discovery. The photographs were the first assault on my sense of reality. High-resolution images of me walking into Dr. Martinez's office building, my face clearly visible as I checked my phone before entering, my body language captured in moments of vulnerability I'd never known were being documented, the way I hesitated at the door during those early sessions when I was still terrified of being discovered, the visible relief in my posture as I emerged after particularly breakthrough conversations, even intimate moments like the Tuesday afternoon I'd sat in my car crying after Dr. Martinez had helped me understand that my anxiety wasn't a character flaw, but a reasonable response to 28 years of emotional surveillance disguised as love. Your father specifically requested images that showed your emotional state, Torres explained quietly, his voice barely audible over the clatter of breakfast dishes and morning conversations happening around us. He wanted documentation of what he called behavioral changes that might indicate you were being influenced against family values, manipulated into developing resentment toward people who loved you, or encouraged to prioritize your own psychological needs over family loyalty and gratitude. Each photograph felt like a violation so profound it made my skin crawl, the realization that moments I thought were private, my nervous habit of touching my therapy appointment card through my wallet, the way I'd sometimes sit in the parking lot for 5 minutes after sessions just breathing and processing what I'd learned, had been observed, analyzed, and cataloged as evidence in some case my father was building against my right to heal without his supervision, input, and ultimate approval. The written notes were somehow even more devastating than the photographs, pages and pages of meticulous observations about my behavior patterns, timing, and what Torres had been instructed to interpret as signs of psychological manipulation by a therapist my father had never met but had somehow decided was dangerous to my well-being and our family relationships. March 15th. Subject appears agitated upon arrival, stays in vehicle for approximately 4 minutes before entering building, exhibits nervous behavior including repeated checking of phone and adjusting of clothing, suggesting anxiety about engaging in activities she knows would disappoint family members. Read one entry that made my stomach lurch because it described with clinical precision my internal struggle during a particularly difficult session when Dr. Martinez and I had discussed the concept of emotional enmeshment, and I'd finally found the courage to use the words psychological abuse to describe patterns in my childhood that I'd been taught to reframe as evidence of exceptional love and protection. Another note, dated from 6 weeks ago, described my emotional state after the session, where I'd finally admitted that I'd been having dreams about living alone in a different city where my father couldn't monitor my daily activities. Subject exits building with notably different posture and facial expression than upon arrival, appears lighter, more confident, walks with less tension in shoulders and more direct eye contact with environment, suggesting possible success of therapeutic intervention designed to undermine family bonds and encourage destructive independence. The clinical language couldn't disguise the fundamental violation of watching someone's healing process being systematically documented as evidence of betrayal, manipulation, and disloyalty to family relationships that apparently couldn't tolerate the existence of any therapeutic progress that hadn't been pre-approved, monitored, and analyzed by someone who equated love with complete emotional transparency and psychological possession. But the audio equipment Torres showed me, small, sophisticated recording devices he'd been instructed to place near Dr. Martinez's office windows if possible, represented a level of violation that crossed from surveillance into territory that could only be described as criminal. The systematic attempt to breach doctor-patient confidentiality for the purpose of gathering evidence that my healing process was actually a form of brainwashing designed to turn me against the father who'd sacrificed so much to keep me safe, loved, and protected from influences he couldn't control or approve. I never actually deployed these, Torres assured me, his hands shaking slightly as he showed me the tiny microphones and recording devices my father had specifically requested. But he was very clear about wanting transcripts of your actual conversations, word-for-word documentation of everything you discuss with Dr. Martinez, particularly anything related to your childhood, your family relationships, or your feelings about his parenting style and continued involvement in your adult life. The sophisticated surveillance equipment represented months of planning, research, and financial investment in violating the most protected aspects of my journey toward emotional independence, the sacred space where I'd finally begun to understand that privacy wasn't selfishness, boundaries weren't disrespect, and healing wasn't betrayal of family loyalty, but essential work of developing into a psychologically healthy adult capable of relationships based on mutual respect rather than control. Monitoring and possession disguised as love. Months of my healing, documented and analyzed like I was a criminal suspect rather than a daughter seeking help for anxiety that was now revealed to be the predictable result of living under constant surveillance by someone whose definition of love had expanded to include hiring professionals to violate the privacy of my mental health treatment, gather evidence of my disloyalty, and potentially sabotage the one relationship that had been teaching me to recognize manipulation, trust my instincts, and believe that I deserve to exist beyond the reaches of someone else's need to monitor, control, and possess every aspect of my emotional and psychological development. Armed with Torres's evidence and 8 months of therapeutic insight about manipulation disguised as love, I drove to my childhood home that same afternoon, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white as I rehearsed the conversation I'd been avoiding my entire adult life. The direct confrontation with a man who taught me that questioning his methods was equivalent to rejecting his love, that needing privacy was evidence of ingratitude, that seeking help outside the family was betrayal of the sacred bond between a father who'd sacrificed everything for his daughter's well-being and a child who owed him complete transparency, eternal gratitude, and unquestioning acceptance of his definition of what protection should look and feel like. I found him in his garage workshop, the familiar smell of sawdust and motor oil mixing with his Old Spice cologne to create an olfactory memory that had once meant safety but now felt like stepping into the lair of someone whose love had metastasized into something predatory, possessive, and fundamentally incompatible with my continued existence as an autonomous adult with a right to private thoughts, professional relationships, and healing processes that didn't require his oversight, analysis, or approval. "Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected as he looked up from the workbench where he'd been organizing tools with the same meticulous precision he'd applied to organizing my entire childhood. "We need to talk about Michael Torres, the private investigator you hired to follow my therapist and document my mental health treatment." The expression that crossed his face was like watching someone's mask slip for just a moment before snapping back into place. First surprise, then something that looked like panic, then the familiar combination of hurt disappointment and defensive anger that had characterized every conversation we'd ever had about his parenting methods, his need for information about my activities, his inability to trust that I could navigate adult life without his constant guidance and intervention. "Amanda, sweetheart," he began, setting down his socket wrench and turning to face me with that particular expression of paternal concern that I now recognized as manipulation disguised as love. "I can see you're upset, but I need you to understand that everything I've done has been to protect you from people who don't have your best interests at heart, who might be filling your head with ideas that could damage our relationship or lead you to make decisions you'll regret for the rest of your life." The casual way he admitted to hiring someone to spy on my therapy sessions, as if it were equivalent to checking my homework or monitoring my internet usage during childhood, made my blood pressure spike in ways that 8 months of anxiety management techniques couldn't control. The realization that he genuinely saw no difference between appropriate parental concern and systematic violation of adult privacy rights, doctor-patient confidentiality, and basic human dignity. "You hired someone to photograph me, Dad," I said, pulling out Torres's manila folder with hands that trembled not from fear but from rage, so pure it felt like electricity coursing through my nervous system. You hired someone to follow my therapist, to document my healing process, to gather evidence that seeking help for anxiety was somehow a betrayal of family loyalty. How is that protection? His face shifted through several expressions as I spread the photographs across his pristine workbench, images of my most vulnerable moments displayed like evidence in a criminal trial, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't shame or recognition of wrongdoing, but something far more disturbing. The absolute conviction of someone who believed that love justified any violation, any invasion, any systematic dismantling of boundaries because his emotional needs and parental authority trumped my right to privacy, autonomy, and mental health recovery that didn't include his input, analysis, and ultimate control. I was protecting you from poison, he said finally, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child who was too naive to understand the complexities of adult relationships and the dangers lurking behind professional smiles and therapeutic techniques. That woman was turning you against your family, teaching you to see love as control, protection as manipulation, encouraging you to develop resentment toward the people who've sacrificed everything to keep you safe and happy. The clinical precision with which he delivered this justification made my skin crawl because it revealed the depth of his delusion, his absolute inability to recognize that the very behavior I'd been discussing in therapy, his need to monitor, analyze, and control every aspect of my emotional life, was exactly what had driven me to seek professional help in the first place, creating a twisted feedback loop where his response to my healing was to escalate the very behaviors that had made healing necessary. Dr. Martinez never said anything against you, Dad, I replied, my voice growing stronger as I found my footing in this conversation I'd been rehearsing in therapy for months. She helped me understand that anxiety isn't a character flaw, that boundaries aren't disrespect, that needing privacy doesn't mean I don't love you. But apparently you couldn't tolerate the possibility that I might develop thoughts and feelings that belonged entirely to me without your input or approval. The way he flinched at the word boundaries told me everything I needed to know about his capacity for self-reflection, his willingness to consider that his methods might be flawed, his ability to love someone without needing to possess, monitor, and control every aspect of their inner life as proof of family loyalty and filial gratitude. You don't understand, he continued, his voice taking on the desperate quality of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged by evidence he couldn't dismiss or explain away. I've spent 28 years keeping you safe, guiding you away from mistakes that could ruin your life, protecting you from people who would take advantage of your trusting nature. And now this therapist has convinced you that my love is somehow unhealthy, that my concern is somehow wrong, that wanting to stay close to my daughter is some kind of psychological problem that needs to be fixed. The circular logic of his argument was breathtaking in its self-serving blindness. My need for therapy was evidence that outside influences were poisoning my mind, while his hiring of a private investigator to violate my therapeutic relationship was evidence of loving protection that I was too brainwashed to appreciate, too ungrateful to recognize, too manipulated by professional strangers to value properly. Standing there in the garage where he taught me to change oil and use power tools, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of my childhood, I realized that I was looking at someone whose definition of love had become so twisted, so possessive, so fundamentally incompatible with my continued psychological development that no amount of explanation, evidence, or therapeutic insight would ever convince him that hiring someone to spy on his adult daughter's mental health treatment was not protection but abuse, not love but possession, not concern but the desperate attempt of someone who couldn't distinguish between being a good father and being a psychological captor who'd spent decades systematically dismantling his daughter's ability to exist independently of his need to monitor, analyze, and control every aspect of her emotional and mental life. Sitting in Torres's rental car outside a McDonald's parking lot the next day, surrounded by the detritus of his 6-week surveillance operation, telephoto lenses, digital cameras, notebooks filled with meticulous handwriting, and a laptop containing what he called the complete behavioral analysis your father commissioned, I began to understand the true scope of how thoroughly my healing journey had been documented, cataloged, and violated by someone whose love had evolved into a form of Psychological archaeology, systematically excavating every moment of my therapeutic progress to search for evidence that my recovery was actually rebellion disguised as mental health treatment. Torres opened his laptop and began scrolling through files organized by date, each one containing detailed observations about my emotional state, behavioral patterns, and what my father had specifically requested be interpreted as signs of therapeutic manipulation or parental alienation. Clinical terms that transformed my journey toward emotional independence into pathology that needed to be diagnosed, documented, and ultimately cured through whatever interventions my father deemed necessary to restore our relationship to his preferred dynamic of complete transparency and psychological dependence. February 3rd. Torres read from his notes, his voice carrying the weight of someone confessing participation in crimes against human dignity. Subject arrives 15 minutes early, sits in vehicle displaying signs of anxiety, including repetitive hand movements and frequent checking of phone. Enters building with hesitant body language, suggesting internal conflict about engaging in activities that contradict family values. Session duration 53 minutes. Exits with notably improved posture and what appears to be relief, possibly indicating successful conditioning against family loyalty. The clinical language couldn't disguise the fact that he'd been documenting the exact moment when I'd finally found the courage to tell Dr. Martinez about the locks on my childhood bedroom door, how my father had presented them as protection while installing what were essentially prison mechanisms designed to ensure I couldn't leave my room without his knowledge, permission, and analysis of where I'd been and what I'd been thinking during my absence from his direct supervision. Every breakthrough, every tear, every moment of recognition and healing had been recorded in excruciating detail. The Tuesday when I'd cried for 20 minutes after realizing that my chronic anxiety wasn't a character flaw but a reasonable response to 28 years of emotional surveillance. The session when I'd laughed for the first time in months after Dr. Martinez helped me understand that wanting privacy didn't make me secretive or deceptive but normal. The afternoon when I'd sat in stunned silence as she explained that healthy parents don't require complete access to their adult children's inner lives as proof of love and loyalty. March 22nd. Subject emerges from building with visible tears, but also appears to be smiling. Stops in parking lot to make phone call lasting approximately 4 minutes. Displays animated gestures suggesting positive emotional state, possibly indicating successful implantation of anti-family sentiment disguised as personal growth. Read another entry that made my stomach churn because I remember that exact moment. It was the day I'd called my college friend Sarah to tell her I was finally understanding why I'd always felt like I was suffocating in my own life, why every decision felt like walking through a minefield of potential disappointment and criticism, why I'd never learned to trust my own instincts because they'd been systematically questioned, analyzed, and often overruled by someone who genuinely believed he knew better than I did about my own thoughts, feelings, and needs. The phone call Torres had documented as evidence of therapeutic manipulation had actually been me sharing the revelation that my father's love, while genuine, had become so controlling and invasive that it was preventing me from developing into a psychologically healthy adult capable of relationships based on mutual respect rather than monitoring, possession, and the kind of emotional transparency that left no room for the privacy and autonomy that healthy boundaries require. The timeline Torres revealed was like watching my recovery being systematically dissected by someone who viewed every sign of my improving mental health as evidence of betrayal, every moment of therapeutic breakthrough as proof that outside influences were poisoning my mind against family relationships that couldn't tolerate my growing sense of self-worth, emotional independence, and understanding of what healthy love actually looks and feels like. April 15th. Subject stays in building for extended session lasting 1 hour and 7 minutes, emerges with what appears to be determination rather than her usual post-session relief, walks directly to vehicle without usual hesitation or checking surroundings, suggests possible escalation of therapeutic intervention designed to encourage confrontation with family authority. Describe the day I'd finally discussed my mother's kitchen warning, her desperate attempt to tell me something she couldn't say directly about the cost of surrendering your autonomy to someone whose definition of love requires complete psychological possession and emotional transparency as proof of loyalty, gratitude, and proper filial devotion. The session had lasted longer than usual because Dr. Martinez, and I had talked about generational patterns of control, how trauma and unhealthy relationship dynamics get passed down like genetic diseases. How my mother's quiet desperation was both a warning about what I might become and evidence that breaking cycles of emotional abuse sometimes requires professional help that exists outside the family system that created and maintains the dysfunction. Every insight, every connection, every moment of clarity about the difference between love and control had been observed through telephoto lenses, documented in clinical language, and reported to my father as evidence that my healing process was actually a systematic campaign to turn me against the people who'd sacrificed so much to keep me safe, protected, and dependent on their guidance for navigating adult life without making mistakes that might damage our relationships or threaten their ability to monitor, analyze, and ultimately control my emotional and psychological development in ways they could understand, approve, and feel secure about, rather than the terrifying possibility that I might develop thoughts, feelings, and relationships that belonged entirely to me without requiring their input, permission, or continued surveillance disguised as loving concern for my well-being and future happiness. 3 days after our McDonald's parking lot meeting, Torres called me with news that would have sounded like fiction if I hadn't already lived through 8 months of therapeutic progress being systematically documented by a man my father had paid to violate the most protected aspects of my healing journey. He'd refused to deliver his final report, return my father's advance payment, and was prepared to testify about the surveillance operation if legal action became necessary to protect both my privacy rights and Dr. Martinez's professional practice from further invasion by someone whose definition of parental love had expanded to include hiring strangers to breach doctor-patient confidentiality. "Your father didn't take it well," Torres admitted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades in investigative work but had never before found himself choosing moral courage over professional obligation. He accused me of being corrupted by the same influences he believes are poisoning your mind. Said I'd obviously been manipulated into betraying a client who trusted me to help protect his daughter from therapeutic abuse disguised as mental health treatment. The conversation that had followed between Torres and my father apparently lasted over an hour, during which my father had alternated between offering double payment for the surveillance reports and threatening legal action for breach of contract, his desperation to obtain evidence of my therapeutic brainwashing, revealing the depth of his delusion about what constituted healthy family relationships versus systematic psychological control disguised as protection, guidance, and exceptional paternal devotion that required complete transparency and emotional accessibility as proof of proper filial loyalty and gratitude. But something unexpected had happened during that confrontation, Torres explained. My father had broken down completely, his facade of righteous parental concern cracking to reveal someone who was terrified of losing the one relationship that had given his life meaning and purpose. Someone whose identity as a loving father had become so entangled with his need to monitor and control that the possibility of his daughter existing independently felt like abandonment, rejection, and proof that his 28 years of sacrifice and protection had been not just unappreciated but actively resented by the person he tried so hard to keep safe from a world he genuinely believed would never love her the way he did. He cried, Torres said quietly, and I could hear something in his voice that might have been sympathy for a man whose love had metastasized into something toxic, but who was finally beginning to recognize the difference between protection and possession, between concern and surveillance, between healthy parental involvement and the kind of psychological monitoring that gradually erodes an adult child's ability to exist autonomously without constant external validation and approval. He kept saying, I just wanted to keep her safe. I just wanted to make sure nobody was hurting her. And I think maybe for the first time he was hearing how that sounded when someone else repeated back to him what he'd actually asked me to do: photograph his daughter without her knowledge, document her emotional states for analysis, gather evidence that her mental health treatment was somehow a threat to family relationships rather than an attempt to heal from anxiety that might actually be connected to his parenting methods. The image of my father crying in front of a stranger, finally confronted with an objective perspective on behavior he'd rationalized as loving concern, created a complex mix of emotions I wasn't prepared to process, part relief that someone had finally told him the truth about his methods, part sadness for a man whose fear of abandonment had driven him to such desperate measures. part anger that it had taken a hired investigator's moral awakening to force him to confront what 28 years of my increasingly anxious compliance should have already taught him about the cost of love that requires constant surveillance and control. Torres had apparently spent the remainder of their conversation trying to help my father understand that healthy relationships, even between parents and adult children, require trust, respect for boundaries, and the ability to love someone without needing to possess, monitor, or control every aspect of their emotional and psychological development. Concepts that seemed foreign to someone whose identity as a good father had become synonymous with his ability to prevent his daughter from making mistakes, experiencing pain, or developing independence that might threaten their relationship or his sense of purpose and value as her primary source of guidance, protection, and emotional support. The most surprising development came 2 days later, when Torres forwarded me an email my father had sent to him, not an apology exactly, but something that looked like the beginning of recognition that his methods might have been flawed, his motivations complicated by needs and fears he'd never examined, his definition of love perhaps more about his own emotional security than my actual well-being and happiness. Mr. Torres, the email read, I want you to know that I've been thinking about our conversation, and while I still believe my daughter needs protection from influences that don't understand our family dynamics, I'm beginning to wonder if my methods have been causing more harm than good. If my fear of losing her has led me to do things that might actually drive her away rather than keep her safe and close to home where I can make sure she's okay. It wasn't a complete transformation or full acknowledgement of the violation he'd commissioned, but it was something, a crack in the wall of defensive justification that had allowed him to rationalize hiring someone to spy on my therapy sessions as evidence of exceptional parental devotion rather than psychological abuse disguised as protection. Torres had become more than just a private investigator who'd chosen conscience over contract. He'd become an unlikely catalyst for forcing my father to confront the difference between love and control, between protection and possession, between healthy concern and the kind of surveillance that systematically dismantles an adult child's ability to develop autonomous relationships, independent thoughts, and the basic privacy that psychological health requires. Sometimes strangers protect us better than family, not because they love us more, but because their love doesn't come with the baggage of unexamined needs, unprocessed fears, and definitions of relationship success that prioritize emotional possession over individual growth, personal autonomy, and the kind of mutual respect that allows people to love each other without needing to monitor, analyze, and control every aspect of each other's inner lives as proof of loyalty, gratitude, and proper appreciation for sacrifices made in the name of protection that might actually be forms of psychological imprisonment disguised as exceptional parental devotion and care. 6 months later, sitting in Dr. Martinez's office for what would be our final regular session before transitioning to monthly check-ins, I realized that the privacy we deserve isn't just about having secrets or keeping things from people who love us. It's about the fundamental human right to exist in spaces where our thoughts, feelings, and healing processes belong entirely to us, where we can explore the deepest parts of ourselves without fear that our vulnerability will be documented, analyzed, and potentially used against us by people whose love has become conditional on their ability to monitor, understand, and ultimately control our inner lives. The lavender candle still burned between us, but now its scent reminded me not of stolen moments of freedom, but of reclaimed territory, space I'd fought for and won through 8 months of learning to distinguish between love and possession, between protection and surveillance, between healthy family bonds and psychological enmeshment disguised as exceptional parental devotion that required complete transparency as proof of loyalty, gratitude, and proper appreciation for sacrifices made in the name of keeping me safe from influences my father couldn't control, approve, or understand. My relationship with my father had changed in ways that were both painful and necessary. We still talked regularly, but now those conversations happened within boundaries I'd learned to establish and maintain despite his continued struggle to accept that my emotional autonomy wasn't rejection of his love, but evidence of the healthy psychological development that good parenting should ultimately foster rather than prevent through monitoring, analysis, and systematic invasion of privacy, disguised as concern for my well-being and future happiness. The therapy appointment card no longer lived hidden in a secret compartment of my wallet, but sat openly in my daily planner, a visible reminder that seeking help for mental health challenges isn't betrayal of family loyalty, but responsible self-care that benefits not just individuals, but entire family systems that have the courage to examine their own dynamics, patterns, and definitions of love that might need updating, refining, or complete reconstruction based on principles of mutual respect, rather than control, surveillance, and emotional possession. Dr. Martinez and I had spent our recent sessions discussing not just my father's surveillance operation, but the broader implications of what happens when privacy becomes a luxury that some people aren't allowed to have, when autonomy becomes a privilege that must be earned rather than a fundamental right that healthy relationships should protect and nurture rather than systematically erode through love that requires complete access to another person's inner life as proof of connection, commitment, and proper appreciation for care that might actually be forms of psychological control disguised as devotion. Privacy isn't about having something to hide, she'd explained during one of our conversations about rebuilding trust with my father. It's about having the space to develop thoughts, feelings, and relationships that belong entirely to you, that don't require external validation or approval to exist, that allow you to become the person you're meant to be rather than the person someone else needs you to be for their own emotional security and sense of purpose. The concept of deserving privacy had been revolutionary for someone who'd been taught from childhood that secrets were selfish, that boundaries were disrespectful, that wanting space from family surveillance was evidence of ingratitude for protection and guidance that other children would envy and appreciate more than I apparently did. According to my father's frequent reminders about how lucky I was to have someone who cared so much about my well-being that he was willing to sacrifice his own comfort, time, and resources to ensure I never had to navigate life's complexities without his input, analysis, and ultimately his approval of my choices, relationships, and emotional responses to experiences he couldn't control or predict. The healing process had taught me that boundaries aren't walls built to keep people out, but bridges built to let the right people in, people who can love us without needing to possess us, who can care about our well-being without requiring complete access to our inner lives, who can offer guidance without demanding that we surrender our autonomy as payment for their concern and protection. What boundaries are being crossed in your life? The question had become central to my recovery, a diagnostic tool for recognizing when love had metastasized into something toxic, when concern had evolved into surveillance, when protection had transformed into psychological imprisonment disguised as exceptional devotion that required gratitude, transparency, and compliance as evidence of proper appreciation for sacrifices made in the name of keeping me safe from influences, experiences, and relationships that might teach me I deserve to exist independently of someone else's emotional needs and definition of what healthy family bonds should look and feel like. My father and I were learning together, slowly and often painfully, that love doesn't require surveillance to survive, that healthy relationships can withstand privacy without interpreting it as rejection, that good parents eventually learn to love their adult children enough to let them exist autonomously without constant monitoring, analysis, and intervention designed to prevent mistakes, pain, or growth that happens outside parental oversight and control. If after hearing Amanda's story you feel there's someone in your family you haven't truly seen, don't wait 8 months like she did to recognize that love without boundaries isn't love, but possession. That concern without respect for privacy isn't protection, but control. That devotion that requires complete transparency isn't healthy family bonding, but psychological enmeshment that prevents the very growth and independence that good parenting should ultimately encourage and celebrate. Tell me in the comments, is there someone in your life you've underestimated? What silent contributions do you think we're overlooking? And don't forget to tell me what city you're watching from. I love knowing where my family is located around the world, people who understand that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is give each other space to heal, grow, and exist without constant supervision, analysis, and surveillance disguised as care. Sometimes the most valuable person is the one who seems invisible, the one whose privacy we respect, whose boundaries we honor, whose autonomy we protect even when it feels like letting go, trusting, and loving without the security of complete access to their inner world. Don't forget to subscribe, because this daughter has many more stories that will make you think about what really matters in family. Not control, not possession, not surveillance, but the kind of love that's strong enough to survive privacy healthy enough to encourage independence, and secure enough to let people exist beyond the reaches of our need to monitor, analyze, and ultimately control their journey toward becoming whoever they're meant to be rather than whoever we need them to be for. Our own emotional security and sense of purpose as protectors, guides, and guardians of people who deserve the fundamental human right to heal, grow, and exist autonomously without constant external validation, approval, and surveillance disguised as exceptional love that requires complete transparency as proof of loyalty, gratitude, and proper appreciation for sacrifices made in the name of protection that might actually be forms of psychological imprisonment we've learned to call family. Devotion,